Hello, everyone. My name is Pradeep Naik, and I'm at the University of Waterloo, representing here the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, as we know that you are joining us today from different parts of the world. I will make a few rounds of introduction, and that includes introduction to the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, and the thematic webinar series. And I will say a few things about today's webinar before we start to watch and listen to the webinar that we have prepared for you today. So just as an introduction, Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability and viability concepts is not just in an economic sense, but also to represent the political, the ecological, environmental, the cultural, the social, and all other aspects of human life, and for that matter, small-scale fisheries. Our focus is on four areas. One is to co-create and co-produce the knowledge that is necessary for the transition from vulnerability to viability, to create a repository of those co-produced knowledge in the form of an information system so that it can be used across all levels of actors. The third one is to develop multifaceted capacity, starting from the community to the policymakers to academia and civil society, who can, in real or in potential, engage in the work of vulnerability to viability transitions. Of course, we have a big component in our partnership to synthesize and integrate the knowledge for making it relevant for governance of small-scale fisheries through knowledge mobilization, knowledge synthesis, and knowledge dissemination. The V2V Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and to engage collaboratively with small-scale fisher communities across the globe and other NGOs, government, and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand. And in 6 countries of Africa, that includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing this work, the V2V Global Partnership brings people and institutions together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The V2V Thematic Webinar series, for which we have gathered virtually today, is an initiative of the V2V Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. V2V Thematic Webinar Series takes place on the last Friday of every month. This month is an exception because of the upcoming holidays. We are organizing this ahead of the last Fridays. But in the future, it will be on the last Friday of every month. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar series, including the speakers, the topics and titles, and links to webinar platform is available on our website, which is www.v2vglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the 12th in the series of V2V thematic webinars planned for the year 2024. Of course, the last one, this being December, and the 48th since January 2021 when it all started. And it is my privilege today to introduce the webinar that we bring to you all. Over the past 4 years, the webinar series has featured academics, policy representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries at the local as well as regional and global levels. This month's webinar is a special webinar as it brings together some of the valuable discussions and key takeaways from the talks delivered in the past 4 years, reflecting on how various concepts, knowledge, ideas, and experiences relating to small-scale fisheries have evolved, especially pertaining to the V2V or vulnerability to viability transition processes. Today's webinar aims to recognize and appreciate the contributions made by a panel of 50 speakers over a period of 4 years to the novel approach of vulnerability to viability transitions and celebrate the ongoing collaboration, learning, and impacts as we look forward to continuing this journey together into the future. So I welcome you all today to the webinar that we have collected from the past 4 years, and I hope you will enjoy watching and listening to this webinar today with all of us. Thank you very much. We'll start the webinar now. Thank you.
This model. I like it so much because really it can get us grounded and get us really connected to what nature in general, but in this case, we are talking about the marine biodiversity, marine ecosystem, marine life, how connected we are, intertwined we are with our natural systems. Sometimes when you live in a high-rise building in a big city in the world, you tend to forget the connection to nature. And this thing here tells you a lot. Whether you're talking about trade or economics or equity, social aspect, cultural aspect, the key point is that we go to the ocean, we go to nature generally to take resources, whether it's fish, many other things, we bring them into our economy and we do what we do with them. We process, we sell, we buy, we eat, we consume, we do our cultural stuff, social stuff. As we do that, think about it. What do? We generate waste. Whether you are pumping out CO2, whether you are throwing away plastic or oil spills. And where do they go to? They go back to the ocean. They go back to nature. So from nature, the good things we like come, and to nature, the bad things we don't like go. And clearly, if you don't do these two things wisely, you are going to destroy the basis of what we need to survive on Earth. So that is the general framing. So essentially, you need marine biodiversity before you can trade fish, before you can make any money out of it, before you can get jobs. And you have to do it so that it benefits as many people as possible. And I think this is one of the main themes of the V2V partnership. That's why small-scale fishes are so central to the partnership, because we have more small-scale fishes by far than large-scale fishes. Our fishing communities depend on fish. They use smaller boats compared to the big industrial, and we need to zoom on them and try to make them as viable and smart as possible so they can actually support as many people as possible. So that is my first main point. Now,
and here we talk about the Wellbeing Ecosystem Services bundles, or WEBs. That is the set of ecosystem services that are tightly associated with some improvements in social well-being of a given community. This is the understanding of it is more general, but the specifics of it is very contextual. So what are the specific set of ecosystem services that provides improvements to different dimensions of well-being. It depends on the context, because different communities may value nature, may value ecosystem services in different ways, especially when you talk about the cultural side of it. This is very context specific, but this idea that there is some set of ecosystem services or some set of natural components that contribute to different dimensions of well-being of a given community, this is something that we can to understand if there's any patterns, generalize it a bit more once we compare different case studies, for example. This is something that is, this concept is broad, but the specifics of it and what are the ecosystem services that provides what type of well-being, this is very context specific.
That's not captured in the indicators of the SDGs. One of the other frames is, of course, and this is certainly not new, but I think needs to be much more powerful or powerfully stated, is that working with and enabling fishers and fish workers provides a pathway to achieve progress towards the SDGs, which is particularly potent when you can consider the number of factors we're talking about. So although I argue, and many would argue, that small-scale fisheries are receiving unprecedented attention in many policy domains and research domains, I think the community remains very uncertain about where small-scale fisheries and where small-scale actors in general, so small-scale actors in agriculture as well, will be situated amidst transformations. So the idea that transformations, or the word invokes positive change. So, for example, this, which I've stolen from the vision of the Nordic food system transformation, which views that a transformation in their food system would lead to the attainment of all the sustainable development goals. All will be well in that transformation and the way that it's navigated. I really love this paper by my good friend and colleague and V2V partner, Jessica Blythe, with an esteemed bunch of authors, but that really points us to some of the risks that are maybe not discussed overtly enough or avoided or planned for or mitigated in the way in which transformations might be playing out, might be planned for, might be funded. And I think we as researchers have a role in kind of understanding and maybe creating an environment that enables those risks to be mitigated and for transformations to be enabling.
Here I want to make a similar argument, and I want to argue that the small-scale fisheries literature very deeply taps in to these two paired ideas of vulnerability and viability. And really, perhaps the grand narrative of the small-scale fisheries literature is this recognition of the serious vulnerabilities that small-scale fisheries face, and indeed the growing vulnerabilities of small-scale fisheries. And the history of the small-scale fisheries literature is also replete with approaches that try to address that exposure to vulnerability that exists for small-scale fisheries. And so, as just a sort of iconic indication of the centrality of vulnerability to the small-scale fisheries literature, I want to go back to this famous idea that Daniel Pauly crystallized, in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is a slide from his Mara conference presentation in 2005, which captures this central argument that underpins the idea that small-scale fisheries are vulnerable. And he had this, he made this very empirically grounded claim that that fisheries around the world, and not just small-scale fisheries, but supplies as much to small-scale fisheries, are suffering from an ecological crisis. And his work provided that empirical foundation for the argument that small-scale fisheries face ecological crisis.
Your ability to engage in migration is also affected by your different positions, your different social identities. And I'd like to draw on an example taken from Chilika Lagoon and taken actually from one of Prateep Nayak's research projects there in that setting. And this is a study that was looking at women's perspectives on environmental change in Chilika Lagoon. And it was looking at two fisher communities that were made up of women from two different castes, a higher social caste, the Katia people, and a slightly lower social caste, the Kandra people. Both communities are affected by environmental changes in the Chilika Lagoon that has resulted in a reduction in the fishing catch and therefore a reduction in livelihoods. And one of the consequences of that has been that there has been migration out from the communities. The first social identity that really becomes dominant here is the identity of gender. Women are much more likely to stay in the city, or excuse me, in the village, and men are much more likely to migrate out. And this is actually common across fisher communities where we tend to see very gendered livelihoods. Women are more likely to be engaged in the processing of fish, and men are more likely to be engaged in fishing. And with that gendered labor, we tend to also see a gendered response to environmental change. Women would also not only maintain the household while the men were away, but would also try to engage in alternative income generation. But the opportunities that were available to women are not only shaped by their gender, but also shaped by which caste they belong to. So the women who belonged to the Kandra caste engaged in a number of livelihood strategies outside of the home, including local daily migrations as wage laborers to other villages. For the Katia women, that was not a possibility because their particular social identity, their caste, did not permit or did not allow that kind of out-migration. So they were expected to engage in livelihoods that were connected only to domestic labor. So when Katia women migrated, it was typically only as part of a family migration.
So on the first part, just generally, what is adaptive capacity? Adaptive capacity really found its roots in the vulnerability scholarship. So that's really related to climate change and things like that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had a lot of documents where they were defining vulnerability and thinking about how we actually set it up. The sort of the conceptualization that they landed on was this idea that vulnerability is related to exposure, which is how affected a system might be by a particular event or stressor. Sensitivity, which is basically how much that matters, like our livelihoods dependent or something like that kind of makes the system more sensitive. But also importantly, vulnerability was a function of this third concept called adaptive capacity, which is essentially how much a system is able to adapt to a stressor. And this diagram is from a really good paper by Nathan Engel of 2011, Global Environmental Change. It just shows how adaptive capacity in this conceptualization really moderates exposure and sensitivity. It can affect both. So it can really change the exposure profile or the sensitivity profile of a community or of a system. And if you're increasing adaptive capacity, there's this idea that you're probably going to be reducing vulnerability. So the space here is smaller, so you have more vulnerability. With higher adaptive capacity in this part of the diagram, you have lower vulnerability. So that's kind of a general conceptualization of how adaptive capacity worked in this scholarship. But adaptive capacity is also really important in the resilience scholarship and in resilience thinking. And even though it's related to how it's thought about in the vulnerability scholarship, it still is conceptualized a little bit differently, just based on how resilience thinking conceptualizes systems a little differently and those types of things. But essentially, the way adaptive capacity works under resilience framing, and again, this is from a paper by Nathan Engel. But so if you think about a system, different system states, where at the top here, in both parts, we have less desirable systems. At the bottom, we have more desirable systems. Systems sort of have this resilience aspect, or how do you maintain a system versus how do you transform it? And that's kind of that altered state that you're going for. And that's that's true of both the desirable and the least, or the more desirable and the least and the less desirable state. And the way that we think adaptive capacity works under resilience framing is kind of related to this idea where systems with less adaptive capacity are more likely to be in a less desirable state. Systems with more adaptive capacity are more likely to be in a more desirable state. So that just gives you a sense of how adaptive capacity works under a resilience framing. But so all that's really important. But today what we really want to talk about is this idea of viability and vulnerability, and how these concepts like adaptive capacity can actually relate and potentially be used to increase the viability of small scale fishing communities. And so I did a quick literature search just to kind of see the papers on adaptive capacity, how do they kind of frame viability, and the term comes up quite a bit, but the concept is rarely given a lot of it's really given a lot of time, or I guess it's rarely defined very well, viability, you know what I mean? It's not necessarily defined in an academic sense. It's used more sort of colloquially in a lot of the literature, which is totally okay, right? But one of the things that I think the V2V partnership really has an opportunity to do is really develop this concept of viability and how it relates to these different other concepts like adaptive capacity and vulnerability and things like that. So this is just kind of a proposition that I would put forth, based on how these things relate. But when you're thinking about adaptive capacity in particular, I'd say, drawing on this kind of resilience framing, when you think about viability, it's probably a more desirable system state, right? So adaptive capacity is probably likely, if you have more adaptive capacity, it's probably likely that you have more viability in the small scale fisheries than if you have low adaptive capacity. So that's one sort of proposition that I would put forward. That's something I'd be happy to discuss after, actually, just to kind of see what everybody thinks about that. But that's kind of, yeah, anyways, that's one idea that I had when I was putting together this talk.
Voluntary guidelines as the first international and globally agreed on piece of policy in support of the rights of small scale fishers. We also looked at debt for blue nature swaps in the Seychelles as the first example of these debt for nature swaps, which are now becoming more and more common in marine spaces. And then as a third example of a potentially transformative change for ocean governance, we looked at the UN ongoing negotiations for a treaty to govern the high seas. And so through these cases, we came up with a few conclusions, which I think are relevant for us who are thinking about and working with small scale fisheries communities. So our first conclusion through the analysis of those cases is that governance transformations don't occur in a void, but rather they're situated within complex and often contested historical policy landscapes that shape how governance can occur. And so, for example, in the Seychelles, it wasn't just that somebody decided that debt for blue nature was going to be a good idea for ocean spaces, but rather that sort of market-based intervention, so saving the ocean by getting the prices right, was really sort of set in motion because of historical legacies of colonialism that led to very high debt profiles in Seychelles that made them, economically vulnerable and probably more incentivized to take on a debt swap. So recognizing that these things aren't just happening in a void, but rather they're really informed by what's happened in the past. Second, we find that governance transformations are driven by an array of actors with different objectives and varying degrees of power. These historically rooted power dynamics shape whose agendas and narratives drive transformational change and whose don't. And in many cases, we find that the narratives of small scale fishers are often overshadowed by larger, more powerful, probably economically powerful voices who get to set transformational agendas. And that is obviously problematic if we are advocating for the rights of small scale fishers. And finally, through that analysis of the three cases, we find across all three cases, transformations create uneven distributions of costs and benefits that sometimes facilitate progress towards a particular goal, but sometimes stall them. And transformational change is obviously very different depending on how it transpires. Sometimes objectives are articulated and negotiated in interactions that may reassemble rights, access, and control. And if I am an advocate, which I am, of, for example, the small-scale fisheries guidelines, I might say, yes, this has been transformative change that has actually reallocated and re-recognized the rights of coastal communities to govern and manage their small-scale fisheries resources. However, there's also potential that existing and often undesirable conditions become further entrenched rather than transformed at all. So we could argue that in the case of Seychelles, power structures were not challenged, but rather they were just further entrenched as a low-income country was made to be continually dependent on global economic policies and finance. So that brings us to the end of the risks and negative part of this talk, hopefully.
The experience of stewardship around the world that you collected through your study is fascinating, but it shows that communities are doing a lot in terms of protecting and nurturing and taking it forward in terms of their small-scale fisheries. How are these communities' stewardship initiatives kind of linked to what is happening around the world in terms of major drivers of impact and influence, and how it shapes the stewardship at a very local community level?
Well, yeah, very good point, Pradeep. And first of all, I should point out that not all of the submissions are success stories. And although the ones I was describing today were more of that sort, they're all initiatives on stewardship and conservation, but some of them have considerable challenges. And in those challenges, I think, are some of those big drivers of concern for small-scale fisheries. And a whole range of those concerns. So one of them is governance. Not everybody is supportive necessarily at a government level of the stewardship going on in small-scale fisheries. As I started out today, the stewardship has been going on in some cases for many centuries, but not always at all with government support. So the whole aspect of governance is one of those drivers that comes in. But then, there's also globalization, economic impacts that come into affecting the well-being, obviously, of small-scale fisheries, and that's going to affect their capability to carry out stewardship. Even though the conservation and stewardship is well understood by the small-scale fishers as being in their own interest, when you're hit with economic impacts, that can affect the capability. And then finally, I just want to say that many of our submissions, and many that we've also seen in the Community Conservation Research Network, have climate change as a serious driver, an impact that's hitting people. And so, we don't want to be naive in thinking that initiatives at a local level will solve economic globalization, governance, and climate change. What we do see, I think, is that fishers are doing what they can within the constraints that they're being faced with.
So, yeah, how do you bring them out of their fear, and then lack of education as a factor contributing to their, marginalization in the hands of moneylenders?
Well, one thing that strikes me is that we have a lot of questions and comments from Bangladesh, and almost all of them are about moneylenders. So this is a really important point in the case of Bangladesh.
Okay.
Probably not everywhere in the world, but I think it's an important point, probably in many places. Okay, I talked about literacy campaigns, education, etc. But let me let me refer back to the last part of my talk, which is about participatory research, participatory development, etc. All these systems that they've used in agriculture. So it's not just an issue of formal education, but it's practitioners, NGOs, as well as universities, researchers, working with communities and educating them, but also helping them understand and deal with their own issues. If you make the fishermen dependent on you, that's not very useful. If you make the fishermen help understand what the issues are and what can be done about it, then that's more useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so standard, the criteria on the left-hand side, just think of a climate change context, because otherwise we can't synergize them. So in a climate change context, if we think, well, if we are thinking of governance, we can see that fifth criterion talks about governance under nature-based solution. On the other hand, in locally led adaptation, we can see governance is so much spread out in many of the principles. If we think of capacity, we need to have the capacity to measure biodiversity. When we're talking about nature-based solution, we need to measure the economic viability. Similarly, capacity development is also thought of in the principles of locally led adaptation. If we think of knowledge, understanding, yes, if we want to design a proper nature-based solution, we need to understand the societal challenge, we need to design it properly. Similarly, under locally led adaptation, we need to understand the robustness. We have to have the proper understanding, the robust understanding of climate risks and future uncertainties. Same goes for trade-off. It talks about equitable trade-off. It talks about transparent trade-off. And finally, the economic viability comes again when we talk about funding. As you can see, there's an arrow between number 4 on the left column and the number 3 on the right column. When we talk about adaptive management on the number 7 criterion of nature-based solution, and it is linked with the flexible programming. So we're talking about adaptive management there. And finally, if we want to mainstream something, if we want to sustain something, definitely we have to go for collaboration. We need to continue investment. So obviously, we can't say that they are saying, no, because these are nature-based solution is a action we take, intervention we take, and these are the criteria which can help us to make it good, effective nature-based solution. On the other hand, when we want to follow the adaptation, locally led adaptation, we have to abide by certain principles. So we can't say they are similar or equal, but they are complementary. So just think of, if we want to implement a nature-based solution in a local setting, we have to follow a locally led adaptation principle to make it a proper locally led adaptation action. But to make it nature-based solution, a good nature-based solution, we need to think of what are the standards, what are the criteria it is fulfilling. That's how, in a bigger LLA setting, nature-based solution to fight climate change can come in.
Yeah, actually the co-management started in 1995 when the communities were not happy to have the influx of the migrating migrants from Lake Kira. When we sat down with the communities to understand their problems and also bring on board the piece of legislation to ban the nets and mosquito nets, there was an improvement. You will see that the numbers were not all that high until 2010, as you mentioned. So that's why in phase 2 we are saying there was the conflicts re-emerged. They came back. I think there was that time, Lake Kira is closer to Lake Chuta. And whenever you have got the episodes, the recessions, they've been so frequent nowadays. Whenever you have got a problem Lake Kibwa, that pressure goes to Lake Kyoto. So from 2010, yes, that the emergence of the conflicts went up, and even we had a number of fishers operating cells. That's why the confiscation of the number of nets went up. And that's when we said, why can't we go in to formalize the agreement? Now the top governments had to come in to those two ministers to sign the agreement. After signing, you can see that there's a now lower. You could see that at least you could see that it's tapering off. Maybe like this year we're talking about 4, last year it was 13, the other year. So the question is, has the formalization worked the wonders? I think that could be the question. But this is what our colleague Van der Linde and the colleagues in 2001 indicated, that we just don't live as it is without formalizing. So probably by formalizing, but we should also formalize them maybe and also try to make a follow-up, not just formalize and live as it is, as we have done. We are more or less on the Marine side. We haven't even met with our colleagues since we signed. It was only in 2017 when we looked at the action plan. Last year it expired. Now we are discussing how best can we do it. So you could see now there's a bit of change, as it were. But we can't celebrate as of now. We can wait for some more years. But we can see it's tapering off. 12 the other year, 13, 2021, and 4 only this year. Thank you.
Thing with regard to water quality parameters, so in your description of water quality parameters, most of the water quality parameters are hydrologically defined. So these are hydrological parameters as far as water quality is concerned. But you do a nice job of linking them to the social impacts and the economic and ecological impacts of that. If I may just ask you what in the context of your research might constitute a social parameter of water quality or a social ecological parameter of water quality. How do you explain that? What are some of the key insights that you may have drawn from your own research in explaining these parameters are more social ecologically driven than just hydrologically driven?
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep, for the great question. Yeah, like most of the explanations that I gave on water quality parameters was more related to hydrological definitions. But in terms of like social ecological aspects, it connects more to the interconnected relations to the water quality. So even when we say like words like turbidity or like the light penetration, which ultimately results in the extensive growth of algae, which is like visually, sometimes if we go to Chilika Lagoon, for participants who have already been to the field school and the project, they might have seen how water pollution has been visibly like seen, like maybe with thermocol dumping or the plastic pollution. So it's not aesthetically pleasing, first of all. And then second, you see changes in variations of species. And then also the changes in the vegetation too, like maybe as I mentioned before, like there were mangroves existing before, which doesn't have much literature on, but right now it's 20% of India's seagrass. But underlying factor might be the changes in hydrological parameters. So in terms of social ecological aspect, it might be shown mostly on the changes in vegetation or the fish pattern or reduction in the quantity of fish or like the amount of vegetation or like changes in the species in vegetations. And maybe related to social structure, it might be more on like terms of health of the ecosystem, even with the people or like the health of the fish, how healthy the fish is, like it changes. It might be due to the changes in water quality parameters. Even sometimes people doesn't recognize like the diseases that they get might be through water quality changes or the water that they interact with daily. So when we went to the community, there were a few people who said, in certain areas that once they go out in the waters of Chilika for fishing, when they come back, they get irritation on skin. If they will feel bubbles around their skin, which was like a sudden experience that they felt, but it might be due to these water quality changes or like certain parameters in water quality that changed. These are like social indicators which is not like technically knowledgeable to them, and then they just literally go to hospital and get treated, but still the same issue happen because the water quality parameters has entirely changed due to certain reasons. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
On some lessons learned on applying the IHH approach in terms of challenges and limitations. It confirmed that there's still lack of sufficient primary data on small-scale fisheries at the country level, in particular about the smallest small-scale fisheries that are most informal, where mostly women are involved, for example, food fishers or small freshwater bodies. Another issue is also the clear definition of small-scale fisheries at the country level, because that sometimes also hampers then collecting the data, understanding what exactly is investigated. Another shortcoming is also that the IHH study is only providing a snapshot in time. It does not provide temporal trends. In terms of benefits, we think that this comprehensive multi-dimensional quantification of small-scale fisheries contributions at the global level, however, can help and is useful. And this was done leveraging different sources and approaches, as I mentioned before, not including also non-fishery specific data sources. An understanding of the environmental, economic, gender, nutrition, governance, and social dimensions of small-scale fisheries through these linked databases that we have created is something that we will spend probably still quite some time on. Also, it was quite important to create opportunities for interaction among individuals from different disciplines in different national level agencies or academia in ways that might be conducive to developing new solutions for small-scale fisheries. And also, it provided us with a well-coupled science policy interface that facilitates empirical findings to be translated to policies at national levels also through the collaboration of the three partners, FAO, World Fish, and Duke University.
So drawing inspiration that we tried to come up with a novel value chain framework where we try to look at value chain, generally in typical value chain, commodity value chain, biophysical research, fisheries are looked at like inbound logistics function instead of it is a very core node to the value chain functions, because unless the resource becomes a commodity and it actually able to produce economic value, that is not taken in within the ambit of value chain analysis. And so that in that context, that becomes very important in the value chain as a inbound logistic functions, but they're not a critical determinant of the whole value chain decision making. So what we try to do is look at value chain resource as a critical node with a critical logic. With the important logic is that if there is no fish, there is no dried fish. So when fisheries become a critical node, then why? Because we have seen in the value chain kind of mapping, the fisheries plays a very critical role in determining price, product quality, and those parameters which are extremely important for any value chain structure, conduct, and performance. So therefore, we thought biophysical resource has to be a critical node within the value chain. And when we look at the biophysical resource as a node, then we have seen there are multiple kind of this is very dynamic. There is a very dynamic interactions that takes place among the actors, agencies, and nodes that exist the value chain. It's not just linear financial transactions. Rather, it's talking about the cultural values, cultural exchanges, your historical dependencies, your kind of a geographical separation, your associations, credit flows. So those kind of things, dynamics becomes very, very, very different when we look at fisheries systems as a critical node into the entire. And then there are ecological as well as human kind of a feedbacks, two-way feedbacks that involves in the systems. When there are two-way feedback, the linkages are quite dynamic and different. So here the linkages are not just seen among the actors, the linkages can be seen within and among different value chain nodes in a very dynamic pattern. So then this whole resource being a critical node, that also gives a new lens to think through the structure, conduct, performance of the value chain, where the structure and conduct structure is node is this whole biophysical resource system, fisheries resource systems has become an important node within the value chain that changes the whole structural configuration of the value chain. At the same time, the behavior and performance lanes is also redefined in the whole process. Here, that gives kind of a new lens to think through. We are not looking at price, product, and profit. Rather, value chain can be looked from different attributes, social ecological systems attributes, such as feedbacks, linkages, uncertainties, and emergencies.
Meantime, if I may just start the discussion by asking you one particular question, which is about the point you made in terms of the direct access of vulnerable communities to the fund itself. And as of now, there is no framework within which this direct access could take place. So can you provide some initial thoughts about what this direct access might look like? Because in the past experience we have seen that it's absolutely problematic when it comes to vulnerable communities directly having a say in the decision making process itself. So can you clarify a little bit in terms of what is the thought at the loss and damage negotiation level in terms of this direct access?
Yeah, Professor Pradeep, that was, I would say, most innovative agreed decision at COP28. But Professor Pradeep and colleagues, the civil societies are also playing very important role in this process. They create, this is Loss and Damage Fund was established, to be honest, very, very much influenced by the civil society and media. So basically, the civil society proposed for this community direct access process. So the idea to access this fund by the vulnerable community is conceptually beautiful. Now you raise the real question, actually, how to develop the modalities then that a vulnerable community can access this fund. Okay, this is still a question for the policymakers. Board is going to deliver this question. We transitional committee agreed the idea. We put forward it to the board. But as I was telling that I'm a community lawyer, let me explain or try to give some idea how to design this mechanism. So basically, at the local level, community-based organizations are there. And I was involved with community-based fisheries management for many years. And as a legal organization, BELA, we tried to provide their legal entity. You will find many CVOs, even in the coastal zone in Coxbazar or other coastal zone in Bangladesh, they have the legal entity. So if a community-based organization, it has is legal entity, it can seek fund anywhere. So now this is the starting point to think about the CVOs, community-based organizations. Then who gonna support them to write their proposal, develop their programs? That's why V2V is there. So you need to support them technically to come up the idea to develop the application process or this. At the same time, we need to talk about the international level. Hey, look, these CVOs are not in a position to develop their plans. They cannot access it. Can you make it easy access, so that they can also take some sort of top-down approach with government to identify relevant CVOs, and they can put some money to an organ to government. Government every year can identify the CVOs they can allocate. Because maybe at international level, it would be difficult to identify the CVOs. But in the loss and damage process, there is a contact point at the national level. That contact point can identify the relevant CVOs through a process. CVOs can get access the fund directly.
So I'm going to start off with a few questions that are coming in, and I have one or two of my own if we have time, Trevor. So that's great. I have one question here from Denise, and it's about this whole issue of data. And the question is, if fisheries data are to be entirely collected by government personnel and make it, and so it becomes a government property, does this not lead to a top-down form of fishery management measures?
So I think the answer is almost undeniably yes. If you consider government as the top, some people consider it as the bottom, but certainly if the collection process is entirely the purview of a government agency, government then has two big things going for it. If you think about it from a bureaucrat's point of view, one is you can control the process. You can control what you harvest, how you harvest, what you collect data on, how you do it, how you store it, and so on. And so you have a high degree of control over the process and on what you share. And so you can see the government interest in that, right? If you're sitting there and you want to have a process that's predictable and that you're able to run and so on, having those data housed internally, and collected internally has a high appeal to it. And so I would say the reply to the question is, for sure, it entrenches this somewhat top-down kind of thing. And until we have systems in place that feature, as a matter of routine, data collected outside the system, the government, that government agency will remain very heavily involved. And the ability of people who are not part of that system to influence the data side of things is low. And until that changes, I think that's going to continue to be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This question is by Sogbe-san Oku Uode. And then the question is, what impacts the ongoing fisheries policy document have on small-scale fisheries governance in Nigeria? So what are some of the impacts of the various drivers you were talking about, really creating a pressure on the small-scale fisheries? And then the next question is Ayofe Ahmed. The question is, are you satisfied with the present level of government involvement in small-scale fisheries development in Nigeria?
Yes, the last one first. I am not satisfied, and I don't think anybody is satisfied, and that is why there's an update going on. It's just that time is of essence, and that needs to be done immediately. When we talk about the expected economic benefits from this, if we domicile the SSF or in Nigeria, I was reading it out. When you go through it, when you have a multi-stakeholder committee where everybody is there, where everybody has a voice, you will be able to improve the socioeconomic life of the people and the operators. It will affect both their natural, their socio-energetical, political life. They will get more gains from their operations because things will be done normally. How to handle the catch at sea, how to bring it back in a quality state that we earn more money. If there are markets and you have markets that the fishermen have access to where they can take their product, and hygienic situation where you have cabinets where they can sell, they have more income. And when you have more income, it impacts on your on their livelihood, they will live better. And there was the issue of other emerging issues that I didn't remember to mention, that nobody has them in the old laws that are now being imputed in the updated one. The issue of climate change, for instance, we've talked about gender. There's issues of transshipment at sea. There are piracy, labor issues. All these ones are just coming up. And because they are now in the law that is being updated, it's going to improve the livelihood of the small-scale operators, because now they will know that they will feel that they are part of the process. When you see government officials inviting them to meetings and treating them with respect, it is one thing. When you are treated with respect, it's different. You feel good about yourself. You want to even follow the law.
So we have these questions to answer. Are these initiatives really triggering processes to enhance the viability of small-scale fisheries in Latin America? But I would say that so far this is a complex answer, right? Because first, not all studies are providing a more historical piece or a complete description of the conflict or injustice. So we have this time frame challenge. And as we know, all these processes are dynamic, they are multidimensional, so it's hard to establish any type of direct cause-effect relationship because of non-linearity. Yeah, but what I would finish the second part, I would like to finish saying that the active social mobilization was very important and seems to be an important source of agency, of collective action, of learning, of empowerment, and a really important way to achieve rights to these small-scale fishing communities.
And so you mentioned that then you were using the CBFM project as an example of that, and that's actually a nice segue to a question that has come in from Nazrul Rimon. The question is, from my experiences, I know the outcomes of many excellent CBFM and co-management initiatives in Bangladesh weren't necessarily sustained after the project period. So, for example, the Empowerment of Coastal Communities project and the Bangladesh Marine Fisheries Capacity Building project. So I presume those ended at a certain point. So what do you think are the reasons for that? Also, how do you contrast these with similar initiatives in Malaysia?
The context is very different between Bangladesh and Malaysia. Bangladesh is like the resources are managed by the so-called powerful groups. Powerful groups mean this risk community, and all these the water bodies. Most of the public water bodies under the control of rich people. So the fishermen are very hard to include in the management of the fisheries. So when the project implemented, the project directly involved in this negotiation and conflicts between the community and the management or administration, like the land department or revenue department. So and some of the conflicts mediated by the involvement of the Department of Fisheries. But when the Department of Fisheries has completed the project, like CBFM project, there is no agency to support administrative support or management support to the community to protect the sustainability of the access. So this is another important thing. So we need to be sustainable support for the long term. Otherwise, this is a long-held property rights established already in Bangladesh. It's difficult to change these property rights.
If I may just start off, by asking you something with regard to the different phases of your work that you explained in the beginning of your talk. where you talked about how you kind of, focused in 2020, of course, this unknown, unexpected drivers such as the COVID-19 and moving on to, projects and processes of understanding conflict, the No Crisis Project. And then, of course, focusing on the governance and the well-being aspect, then finally leading to justice and policy. I wanted to know, if this is how things emerged and evolved in the context. Of course, part of it is driven by, the projects that you were involved, but, you were telling a story of a set of community that have been grappling with these issues, and there's a sequence to it. You deal with COVID, and COVID is almost over, and then new challenges come in. So how do you build that sequence, in terms of, all these four things, and of course the natural disasters being a constant driver,
Right. Thank you for that question. It has been interesting actually to put, or the time series of research. And when we started out, it was a very much problem-driven, okay, a shock happened, unexpected COVID, or even extreme weather. But then the impacts that they were feeling or they were experiencing was bigger than the stressor. There was other underlying issues which aggravated that stressor. A stressor might come, but if they had access to, if they could access social protection properly in the system, if they could have a say in how things are governed, then it might help to build their resilience stronger. But those underlying issues always remained, not having access to markets, not having access to finance, lack of education. So regardless of what the stressor might be, it might not be weather or COVID, it might be something completely different, but they would, if you don't address those, really equity issues, you won't, it might be any stressor and you'd still be left in that vulnerable position. So we need to be looking at it kind of, higher, what are those, rights and justice. And that came, later. We didn't go out looking at it from a justice lens, we looked at a problem. But if you're looking at it from a solution perspective, you need to address, the wider governance and justice issues to address stressors.
It does have a
then piracy, and then the IUU, which is a major problem in this sub-region. It is estimated that between 2.3 billion to 9.4 billion US dollars are being lost to illegal fishing by fleets operating in West African countries. Then the impact of IUU in terms of vulnerability of the fishers include sometimes forcing them, because of their operation, into the coast or into the creeks, has ensured that the fishers have to go deeper into the ocean, and this has also affected the size of the canoe, as we will get to know, or as we are aware of, leading to loss of income. And then the fishers claim that when they get in contact with the IUU fishers, there's usually attack, which may lead to their deaths. So fishers who are not able to withstand this kind of negative impact have sometimes also felt, well, they either move away from fishing operation entirely or join the bandwagon of piracy. And this is why the region security is very important. If we continuously expose the small-scale fishers then to the negative impact of IUU, then piracy will continue to increase.
and it goes back to some of the systems ideas and the concepts that you've highlighted. And I think the idea of this notion of a tightly coupled system and how that plays out in these different ways. It's a reminder for me again that, small scale fisheries are also these tightly coupled systems. We can think about them at different scales, but they're full of feedback loops and things like that. And so this notion that you were talking about at the beginning in terms of coupled systems and tipping points and things like that, how are you seeing sort of the ecological tipping points within that metabolic kind of perspective and social tipping points as being related, or are they two different things? Are they connected in some particular ways that help us understand this idea of thresholds and tipping points and things like that? So it's just more of an open-ended question about this concept and the relationship between the ecological and the social dimensions of tipping points.
Sure. Yes, they can certainly be connected, and they can play out very rapidly on small islands. Let me give you an example of a Greek island that we have been studying for over a decade. And this is what happened was that this is the island of Samothrace, which is in the Aegean Sea. And some time ago, the EU introduced subsidies for the livestock. So they said, okay, when you have goats, you have livestock, we will pay you in order to support the EU farmers. We'll pay you certain amount per head. And so there was this incentive to grow the numbers of goats just for the subsidies, even if these were not very productive animals. So you saw suddenly the numbers increased, and they went 3 times in the carrying capacity. 80,000 goats. They were not used often for meat or milk, but the subsidies were driving the increase in the goat numbers. And we know that goats, when they graze, they can cause a lot of overgrazing. So so the overgrazing, digging into the soil, and so the island started to face serious soil erosion at the edges, everywhere. So the island was pretty much eaten up. And when washed, and with islands, they're experiencing a lot of flash floods as well. So there were these kind of flooding situations where a lot of soil was just going into the oceans. So what we experienced here by one intervention, it was meant in a good way to support the farmers, but that cascaded into an ecological tipping point, which meant that there was huge amount of soil loss, and that was washed into the oceans. That affected the marine system around. So it affected the fisher communities. So that is a livelihood system, and that we have observed ourselves very, very closely. So
resulting from those interventions, policy interventions. So I would start with some questions that we have it here. A question from Mundus Maris. And the question is, what are the differences in fishing technologies in permanent and daira water bodies? Institutional arrangements in combination with technology tend to strongly influence sustainability related changes. So are there differences in fishing technologies in the permanent land, permanent and the daira water bodies?
So, yeah, are you asking, I mean, about the modern day technology, or you are asking about the traditional technology?
Even the traditional technology, I think, because, the daira land is, something that comes and goes, so, and it has a temporal dimension related to the water flow and all. So the question is, are there different fishing techniques or technologies when you're,
So
doing
of course,
fishing?
I mean, yeah, it's a good question actually. So daira land, when daira land, as you know, is a temporary land, and then the water bodies that we find is at various places. I mean, sometimes not exactly in the main river water where the water is so deep.
the Deara land itself has some water bodies, which is where you don't have much of the depth in the river. I mean those water bodies. So what happens is that the common technique that they apply are very traditional ones. So they would sometimes put a net, and then they will try to catch the fishes, because it is kind of a stable water. In their landscape, when you have those water bodies, these are stable water. They are not flowing water. So what they do is that they put a net and then take out net from a particular area, so that they can take out fish. So it is different from the main river bodies, not like the main river bodies where you have the flowing water.
Wow, that was a really great 1 hour or so, listening to so many bright ideas and experiences from so many speakers that have worked dedicatedly in the domain of small scale fisheries. Thank you very much for watching this special issue of the V2V thematic webinar today. That is a collection of ideas, as I already said, from the past 4 years of our webinar series. Please post your comments and questions in the chat section of the YouTube, and we will get back to you, because we are not having a live speaker today to answer your questions. So do please write your comments and questions in the chat on YouTube. So this concludes our 2024 series of webinars. We will be back with a new series of V2V thematic webinars in 2025, which will take place on the last Friday of every month. So please stay tuned, as we will post relevant information on our website, which is again www.v2vglobalpartnership.org. Until then, goodbye, and please have a wonderful holiday season and a happy, peaceful, and healthy New Year 2025. See you all in 2025 in our newest series of B2B thematic webinar talks starting in January. Thank you once again. Thank you very much.